When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear of being caught, but because of those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I lunged to snatch the phone from his hands, but he jerked it away, gripping it tighter, and kept reading. I watched his face shift, line by line, emotion by emotion, and felt my world unraveling 1 second at a time. He was about to find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled as he swiped again, and I knew he was getting close to that message. The one that would seal it all. Or worse, twist everything beyond recognition. Suddenly, the phone buzzed in his hand. A new notification lit up the screen. I saw his face go pale as he read the name of the sender. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I'd never broken when nerves took over. My breath quickened, my stomach clenched, and everything inside me screamed. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that shattered the rhythm of my life and left a fracture I could no longer ignore. Now, I had no idea what to do next. But maybe, just maybe, I can tell you how it all really happened. Before I share the secret I've hidden so carefully for so long, tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried to bury, only to watch it claw its way back to the surface? It didn't begin with love, or even lust. It began with silence. The kind of silence that fills a house at dusk, when the news hums from the living room, dishes clink in the sink, and your husband says, "Dinner's good," without looking up. That was our life. Predictable. Safe. Familiar in the way old furniture is, worn, but impossible to throw out. I was 53. Still working, still holding everything together. Work was my structure. I'd built a reputation over decades. Not flashy, not loud, but solid. Reliable. I handled reports, logistics, negotiations. No one saw me as anything more than capable. Which is another word for invisible, once you hit a certain age. Then the new manager arrived. He wasn't what I expected. Younger, but not arrogant. Confident in a quiet way. He asked questions no one else did. Not just about the job, but about the why of the job. He remembered names. He noticed when I changed my earrings. He made people feel seen. Including me. It started with meetings that ran late. Not intentionally, they just did. I'd look up and realize it was almost 7, and he'd still be there, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, talking through strategy. He'd offer me coffee. Ask what I thought. Not about the task, but about the direction, the long-term vision. Things no one had asked me in years. One Thursday, after a long meeting about the quarterly restructure, everyone had left. I stayed behind to finish up the summary. He lingered too. We worked in silence, side by side. The air felt charged in a way I couldn't name. Not romantic. Not sexual. Just awake. He said, almost casually, "Do you ever feel like you're running on autopilot?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I could. No one had asked me that in. God, I don't even remember. I said, yes. That was it. No follow-up. No probing. Just that word hanging between us, reverberating. That night, I came home and found my husband watching golf. He asked if I'd picked up the dry cleaning. I hadn't. He sighed, muted the TV, and got up to do it himself. The next morning, I looked in the mirror and saw something unfamiliar. Not regret. Not guilt. Just awareness. Like a window had opened a crack. Our project moved quickly. We had a big deadline, and I became the point of contact between the regional offices and upper management. He worked closely with me, always respectful, always measured. But I started noticing the pauses. The way he waited for me to finish a sentence. The way he nodded, as if what I said mattered. One afternoon, he touched my arm when passing behind me. A simple gesture. Innocent. But I felt it like static. It stayed on my skin hours later. At home, I mentioned the project to my husband. He nodded without asking questions. I wondered if he even remembered the name of the company I worked for. I wondered if he knew the name of my boss. I couldn't remember the last time he asked how my day really was. One evening, I stayed later than usual. Everyone had gone. The office lights were dimmed, and I sat reviewing figures. He appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups. Coffee? I hesitated, then accepted. We sat. Talked about nothing and everything. He told me he used to want to be a teacher. I told him I once dreamed of painting, something I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. He smiled. Why did you stop? I looked at the window. Rain had started, soft and rhythmic. I got busy being responsible. He didn't say anything. Just nodded, slowly. That night, I drove home in silence. No radio. No calls. Just the sound of rain on the windshield and the memory of that conversation. It wasn't wrong. But it wasn't nothing either. At dinner, my husband chewed in silence. I watched his hands, broad, familiar, lined with time. The same hands that once traced my collarbone. Now they held utensils like tools, purposeful, mechanical. Everything okay at work? He asked, glancing at his phone. I said, fine. The next day, I told myself I'd keep it strictly professional. But when he passed by my desk and left a sticky note that read meeting moved to 2 p.m. Hope you get a breather before then, smiley face, I felt my stomach flip. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a come on. But it was something. And that something echoed in the places where my marriage had gone quiet. I started dressing differently. Subtle changes. A blouse I hadn't worn in years. Earrings with color. A hint of perfume I'd stopped using after our son left for college. I told myself it was for me. That might have even been true. One weekend, my husband and I went to dinner. Our anniversary. He booked our usual spot. We ordered our usual meal. We said the usual things. Halfway through, he looked at me and said, "You seem different lately." I paused. Good different or bad? He shrugged. Just, not yourself. I smiled and excused myself to the restroom. In the mirror, I didn't look different. But I felt different. Lighter. Not because of anyone else. But because someone had reminded me that I still existed. By the time I returned to the table, he was scrolling through sports scores. I sat down and said, I might travel next week. For work. He nodded. Do what you need to do. That was always his answer. And maybe that was the problem. I didn't know where this was heading. I didn't even know if there was a this. But something had begun. And I wasn't sure I could stop it. The request came late Friday afternoon. A meeting had been added for Monday morning, out of town, client side, and I was the only one available to go. He stopped by my desk before leaving for the weekend, holding the printout like it was nothing. They asked for you specifically. I said I'd join too, since we're presenting together. I nodded, keeping my eyes on my computer screen. I didn't trust myself to speak. The air between us hadn't shifted, but something inside me had. I could feel it, closer to the surface now, impossible to ignore. At home, I told my husband about the trip. He didn't react much. Just said, let me know if you need help packing. The suitcase I used had been sitting in the closet for years. I wiped the dust from its zipper and filled it with neat rows of blouses, slacks, and one navy dress I hadn't worn in a decade. As I folded each item, I thought about the meeting. About how it was just business. About how I had told myself that 100 times already. The hotel was modest, clean, corporate, unremarkable. We checked in separately, exchanged quick looks and polite words. No shared ride. No room next door. Nothing that could be misunderstood. At least not yet. The meeting itself was long. Technical, draining. I stayed focused, sharp, alert. When he handed me the floor, I didn't hesitate. I made my points with clarity, the room listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. Not just competent, *needed star. He smiled as I wrapped up. It wasn't patronizing or flirtatious. It was proud. Afterwards, we stepped outside. The city buzzed in the background, but the evening felt still. We walked down a nearby street, found a small restaurant with dim lights and soft jazz. We didn't talk much at first. Just ordered wine and waited for the food. He asked about my son. I told him about college, about how the silence in the house got louder when he left. He nodded. I asked if he had children. He said no, but that he sometimes thought about what kind of parent he'd be. We talked about books, memories, missed opportunities. It was warm inside. My wineglass was almost empty. His fingers tapped the table in rhythm with the music. He said, "You've changed." I laughed lightly. That obvious? He shook his head. Not in a bad way. You just seem more awake than when we first met. I looked down. My hand was resting on the menu, but I wasn't reading. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment, but from recognition. Because I was awake. And I hadn't realized how deeply I'd been asleep. We left the restaurant without saying much. The streets were quieter now, the sidewalks glistening from a light rain. He walked me to the hotel, stopping just short of the entrance. We stood in the stillness. Cars hummed in the distance. I watched the light from the street lamp catch in his hair. And then, we kissed. Not planned. Not discussed. Just a moment that happened, like something breaking through the surface after being held down too long. I didn't step back immediately. I didn't apologize or explain. I let the silence fill the space afterward, because I didn't trust words. I turned, walked inside, and took the elevator alone. Back in my room, I didn't sleep right away. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, staring at the carpet. Not out of guilt. Not yet. But because something inside me had shifted again, and I wasn't sure how far it would go. The next morning, we met in the hotel lobby. His eyes held no assumptions, no pressure. Just acknowledgement. He asked if I was ready. I said yes. The drive home was quiet. He drove, I watched the road. The sky was low and gray, the kind of weather that makes everything feel suspended. He didn't reach for the radio. I didn't reach for conversation. When we got back to the office parking lot, he turned off the engine and looked straight ahead. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen, he said quietly. But I'll follow your lead. Whatever that is. I nodded. Thank you. I stepped out and closed the door behind me. The click of it echoed louder than I expected. At home, the routine waited for me. Mail stacked on the counter. Laundry that hadn't folded itself. My husband looked up from the couch when I entered, eyes scanning me briefly before returning to his tablet. Good trip, he asked. Yes, I replied. Dinner was quiet. The TV mumbled in the background. He passed the salt without looking. I watched him for a long time, studying the face I knew so well, the habits so deeply ingrained. Later that night, I stood in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, catching my own reflection. My lipstick was gone, my eyes tired. But something underneath still pulsed. A sense of contradiction, alive and ashamed. Bold and trembling. Like I had lit a candle in a dark room I hadn't entered in years. I lay in bed next to my husband, the space between us wide and unmoving. I stared at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. Even. Familiar. Indifferent. I closed my eyes and remembered the sound of that street lamp buzzing above us, the softness of his voice, the brief warmth of something not allowed. Something that had now already happened. The days that followed were deceptively normal. Memos, emails, meetings. The usual rhythm of the office hummed along as if nothing had changed. But I had changed, and no amount of paperwork or polite greetings could conceal that. I noticed the shift in small ways. The way I hesitated before speaking, choosing my words more carefully. The way I avoided the break room when I knew he'd be there. The way I kept my phone screen tilted away from my husband at dinner, even though I had no new messages from him. Just a lingering guilt I couldn't name. He didn't reach out. Not in the way I expected. No follow-up texts. No cryptic smiles. Only a quiet professionalism that made the silence louder. I wasn't sure if I was grateful or disappointed. At home, everything was as it had been. My husband moved through the house with practiced familiarity, loading the dishwasher, setting the remote beside his chair, folding laundry without being asked. He was helpful. Present. But distant in the way someone becomes when they've long since stopped asking questions. He didn't suspect. Or if he did, he chose not to look too closely. That, somehow, hurt more than any accusation would have. One evening, while finishing dinner alone, he was working late, I found myself staring at a single glass left on the table. It had a faint lip print, and I realized it was mine. That something of me had been left behind, even in the quietest places. I didn't mean to write the message. It started as a note to myself. A draft in the Notes app on my phone, typed out in the dark of our bedroom after he'd fallen asleep beside me. I wrote, "I don't regret what happened. I regret how much it made me feel." I stared at that line for a long time. In the morning, I deleted it. Work didn't stop. The project intensified. Deadlines were pulled closer, and with them, so were our meetings. He and I sat across from each other in boardrooms and at whiteboards, always professional, always focused. But every once in a while, I'd catch him looking, not inappropriately, not with desire, but with awareness. Recognition. Like we shared a secret that neither of us dared name. One afternoon, I dropped a folder outside the elevator. He reached down at the same time I did. Our hands touched. It was a brief moment, accidental even. But my chest tightened as if I'd run a mile. He stepped back quickly, letting me gather the papers. No words. Just a slight nod. In the elevator, we stood side by side. Too close, too still. The doors opened on our floor, and we walked out without a glance. That night, I didn't speak much at dinner. My husband talked about the news, a colleague's retirement, the price of something he'd seen at the store. I nodded, made appropriate sounds, but my mind was elsewhere, looping through every detail of the day, every breathless pause. Afterward, while loading the dishwasher, I felt him watching me. I turned and met his gaze. He didn't smile. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I shrugged. "Just tired." He nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. He left the kitchen, and I stood there with my hands in soapy water, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. The following Monday, I arrived at work early. I wanted to avoid him, or at least the possibility of another moment that might spiral out of control. I buried myself in reports, headphones in, pretending to listen to music just to shut out the world. He arrived late. Unusual for him. He nodded when he passed by my desk, and I returned the gesture, nothing more. But I could feel something simmering beneath the calm surface. Midday, we had a team meeting. Our manager asked for volunteers to lead a new regional initiative. He looked around the room. I felt his eyes pause on me for half a second longer than necessary. I didn't raise my hand. Back at my desk, a message popped up on my screen. Just checking in. You okay? I hesitated. Then typed back, yes. Just focused. His reply came quickly. Good. You were brilliant in the last pitch, by the way. Thought you should know. I closed the chat. I didn't respond. That evening, I found myself pacing in the guest bedroom, our son's old room. The bed still had the same cover from when he left for college. A poster was still pinned to the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the stillness settle in. I remembered the kiss, not just the physical act, but the moment after. The silence. The mutual knowing. It hadn't felt reckless. It had felt inevitable. Like something that had been growing in a hidden place and finally cracked through the surface. What scared me wasn't that it happened. It was that I wanted it to happen again. The next morning, I dressed with more intention than usual. A darker blouse, a necklace I hadn't worn in years. Not for him, I told myself. For me. But I knew that wasn't entirely true. At the office, I kept busy. Avoided small talk. Declined lunch invitations. He didn't approach me, and I didn't seek him out. The day passed without incident. But later, as I packed up to leave, I saw something on my desk, a small sticky note, folded over once. No name. No handwriting I recognized at first glance. I unfolded it. Nothing has to happen. But it doesn't mean it didn't mean something. That night, I hid the note inside a book on my nightstand. Not because I needed to keep it, but because I couldn't bear to throw it away. My husband was already in bed when I entered the room. He looked up. You're late. Had to stay behind. Reports. He didn't say anything. As I undressed in the dim light, I felt his eyes on me. Not with desire, but with curiosity. As if trying to remember something forgotten. I lay down, facing away from him. The distance between us felt greater than the physical space. And yet, in my chest, there was something alive again. Something dangerous. Something I couldn't name. The morning started like any other, but something in the air felt misaligned. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but gray clouds rolled in slowly, casting a haze over the familiar route to work. My coffee tasted too bitter, my blouse didn't sit right on my shoulders, and I was acutely aware of how tightly I was holding the steering wheel. The radio played softly, but I wasn't really listening. I couldn't get that note out of my head. I had read it at least a dozen times the night before, each time feeling a different wave of guilt, curiosity, and something else, something I refused to name. At the office, I slipped in without speaking to anyone. I needed the comfort of routine, but even that felt brittle now. The project we had been working on was nearing its peak. Deadlines loomed, and stress filled the corridors, giving me a reason to bury myself in work. I sat at my desk, turned on my monitor, and tried to lose myself in spreadsheets and performance charts. I didn't see him that morning. Whether by coincidence or intention, he wasn't on the floor. Part of me was relieved. Part of me wasn't. Around noon, I received a calendar invite for a joint presentation scheduled for the following Friday. It was from him. The note attached was short, "Final client review. Might need to prep offsite this week. Let me know what works." There was nothing unusual about it. Nothing inappropriate. But it still made my stomach clench. I stared at the message for a while before replying, "Understood. Let's coordinate by midweek." I kept it formal. I wanted to believe I meant that. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time I looked up from my work, the office had started to thin out. I gathered my things, not expecting anything different. But as I passed the main conference room, I caught a glimpse of him sitting alone, reviewing something on his laptop. Our eyes met briefly, and I froze for a fraction of a second. He didn't smile. He just held my gaze, then looked back at his screen. I walked away. At home, I cooked dinner without needing to ask what my husband wanted. I knew the answer. I always knew. Roast chicken, steamed vegetables, no salt. I moved through the kitchen like muscle memory, hands chopping and seasoning while my mind drifted elsewhere. We ate in silence. He read something on his tablet while chewing slowly. I noticed the way he chewed the inside of his lip when he was deep in thought. A habit I had once found endearing. Now it only reminded me of how little I noticed it anymore. Halfway through the meal, he asked, "Still busy at work?" "Yes," I replied, not looking up. He nodded, said nothing more. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection again. My face looked tired, older than it had in my mind. But my eyes, they held something unfamiliar. A mix of restlessness and sadness that I couldn't place. Or maybe I just didn't want to. I went to bed early, claiming exhaustion. My husband stayed up, flipping through channels. The television buzzed softly through the closed bedroom door. The next day, I arrived early again. I wanted the quiet before the chaos of another demanding workday. I sat in the empty break room with a cup of tea, letting the steam fog up my glasses. I thought about the off-site meeting. The way it hovered in the air between us, unspoken but inevitable. As the office filled, I moved through meetings, checked off tasks, answered emails. But the calm was fragile. Midday, I opened my inbox and found a new message from him. It wasn't personal. It was a document for review, relevant to the upcoming presentation. But at the bottom of the message, he'd added one line, "Would prefer to prep somewhere quiet. You choose the place." I stared at that line for several minutes. It was neutral. Respectful. But it left the decision in my hands, and I wasn't sure I wanted that responsibility. That evening, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove aimlessly for almost an hour. The city passed by in streaks of light and blur. I turned off the main roads and parked near an old bookstore I used to visit when I was younger. I didn't go in. I just sat in the car, hands in my lap, and tried to remember who I was before everything became so tangled. When I finally got home, it was past 9. My husband looked up from the couch as I entered. "You eat?" I nodded. Grabbed something on the way. He didn't ask where. I didn't offer more. We sat in the same room for an hour, watching the same news, but feeling 100 miles apart. He didn't touch me. He hadn't in weeks. Maybe months. I wasn't sure anymore. That night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of the heater clicking on and off. I thought about the upcoming Friday. About the quiet space I needed to find. About whether I wanted that space to be as neutral as I pretended. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. I didn't check it. The next morning, I chose a small co-working space on the edge of the city. It had glass walls, a cafe downstairs, and no one who would recognize us. I booked a 2-hour block for Thursday afternoon. Then I sent him the details. He replied with a simple "got it. Thanks." Nothing more. And yet, I felt my pulse pick up just seeing his name. The week moved in slow motion. Every moment was too quiet or too loud. I performed my duties with precision, answered questions with just enough warmth. But inside, I was circling something. A decision I hadn't made. A boundary I hadn't redrawn. At home, my husband was attentive in small ways. He offered to make tea. Mentioned a film I liked. Suggested we visit our son for the weekend. I nodded at each, smiled when required, thanked him softly. But something between us had shifted, and neither of us knew how to address it. On Wednesday night, I stood in front of my closet, choosing what to wear for Thursday's meeting. I told myself it didn't matter. That it was just work. Just a presentation. Just logistics. But I still changed outfits 3 times. I fell asleep with the lights on. And dreamed of nothing. The co-working space was quieter than I'd expected. Clean, modern, filled with that soft ambient hum of people being quietly productive. I arrived 15 minutes early, more out of nerves than practicality. The receptionist showed me to a glass-walled room tucked away in a corner, one of those half-private spaces that made you feel seen but separated. I set my laptop on the table, smoothed out the creases in my blouse, and told myself this was just work. Just prep. Just 2 adults managing a project. But my hands betrayed me. I kept checking my phone for no reason. Kept rearranging the pen beside my notebook. My reflection in the window looked composed, but I could feel the tremor in my chest, the quiet thrum of something unsettled just beneath my ribs. He arrived exactly on time. No fanfare, no hesitation. He greeted me with a soft "good afternoon," and settled across the table, opening his laptop like this was any other day. I was grateful for it, the normalcy. The professionalism. The fact that he didn't treat this meeting like anything more than what it was meant to be. For the first 10 minutes, we talked only about the client, slide transitions, delivery points, the updated numbers from the finance team. I found myself relaxing into the rhythm, slipping back into the role I knew best, competent, organized, focused. The tension began to dull, just slightly. But then, during a lull between revisions, he looked up and asked, "How've you been?" I hesitated. It was such a simple question, and yet it felt like a trap. I considered brushing it off with something generic. Fine. Busy. Nothing new. But something in his tone, soft, careful, invited more. "I've been thinking a lot," I said, choosing each word with care. Trying to stay focused. He nodded slowly. Me too. The silence after wasn't awkward, but it wasn't easy either. It stretched long enough for both of us to acknowledge it, but not long enough to break the illusion that we were still pretending this was only about work. We moved on. Back to details, slides, pacing. Our laptops clicked quietly as we edited side by side, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. Every so often, our eyes would meet over the top of our screens, and we'd quickly look away, like children caught somewhere they shouldn't be. A little over an hour into the session, the receptionist knocked gently and asked if we needed anything. I declined. He asked for coffee. When she left, he leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled. "This place is nice," he said. "Quiet." "Too quiet," I replied before I could stop myself. He smiled. I figured we needed somewhere without distractions. The implication hung between us. I didn't answer. The coffee arrived, and we paused to take a break. I watched the steam curl above the rim of his cup and noticed how tired his eyes looked. Not in the way of someone who hadn't slept, but in the way of someone carrying more than they were used to. He looked up suddenly. I didn't want to make anything harder for you. I blinked. You didn't. I mean that, he said. Whatever happens, or doesn't, I want you to know I respect you. All of this. I didn't plan any of it. Neither did I said softly. The room felt smaller then. The walls hadn't moved, but something in the air tightened. I could feel it in my chest, like the breath I hadn't taken properly in minutes. We turned back to the presentation. Finished finalizing our points. Reviewed the agenda. But our movements had slowed, and the words came less easily. I kept thinking about how things were both unchanged and completely different. When we finally closed our laptops, the silence returned. Not the comfortable kind from before. This one was sharp. Suspended. I should go, I said. He nodded. Of course. I stood, gathering my things, and for a moment, I fumbled with the zipper on my bag. My hands were shaking. Not visibly, but enough that I noticed. When I turned toward the door, he stepped aside to let me pass. But instead of moving immediately, I paused. My hand hovered near the handle. We shouldn't, I started. I know, he said, already finishing the sentence I hadn't been brave enough to complete. I turned the handle and stepped out. The hallway felt colder than I remembered. Brighter. I didn't look back. Driving home, I kept the windows down even though the air was cool. I needed something to sting my face, to remind me that I was still grounded. That I hadn't floated too far away from where I was supposed to be. At home, my husband greeted me with a question about dinner. Nothing more. He didn't ask where I'd been. I told him I had meetings outside the office. He accepted it without hesitation. Later, we sat on the couch watching a documentary. He held the remote, I held a cup of tea. Our hands never touched. Our eyes never met. In the quiet moments between scenes, I found myself thinking about how familiar everything was. How deeply I knew this man beside me. His routines, his opinions, the way he always turned his socks inside out before putting them in the hamper. I knew him. But I didn't feel known in return. When he turned off the TV and went to bed, I stayed behind. I sat in the dark, the television screen blank and faintly reflecting the outline of the room. I listened to the distant sound of traffic, the creak of floorboards above, the hum of the refrigerator. And I thought about what it meant to want more. Not because something was broken, but because something inside me had awakened, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't put it back to sleep. The presentation went as smoothly as we had planned. Maybe even better. The client was receptive, the feedback constructive, the atmosphere charged with a quiet energy of mutual respect. We were a good team, and it showed. The slides transitioned seamlessly, our pacing was in sync, and even the pauses felt purposeful. But beneath the surface of every word I delivered, every nod I offered the room, I was acutely aware of his presence beside me. His voice. His timing. His quiet glances that never lingered too long, but always seemed to land at just the right moment. When it ended, there was a short round of polite applause and a few minutes of informal conversation. He and I fielded questions, exchanged business cards, thanked the attendees, and packed up our materials. It was all so ordinary. So structured. But under that polished surface, something inside me was coming undone. Back at the office, everyone was upbeat. The project had been a success, and there was talk of recognition from the regional leads. A few people stopped by my desk to offer congratulations, and I accepted them with a practiced smile, even as my heart felt heavier with each passing minute. Success didn't feel like relief. It felt like a distraction I didn't want. He didn't approach me that afternoon. He sent a message, short, efficient, nothing personal. Thanks again for the prep. You handled the tough questions brilliantly. I replied with a simple appreciate it. Good work today. It was all that needed to be said. And yet, it left so much unsaid. That night, my husband suggested dinner out. I was surprised. He rarely made spontaneous plans. But I agreed, half out of habit, half out of guilt. We went to a quiet place we used to frequent years ago, back when date nights were a thing we planned for, not something we stumbled into out of obligation. He asked about the project. I gave him the highlights. He nodded, seemed genuinely pleased. Told me he was proud. I said thank you, but the words didn't sit right in my mouth. I wasn't sure why. Over appetizers, he mentioned he'd been thinking about taking some time off work. We haven't traveled in a while, he said. Maybe we could take a week. Just us. Like old times. I looked at him. His expression was open, maybe even hopeful. There was nothing wrong in what he was saying. In fact, there was everything right about it. But I couldn't breathe for a second. Because I realized I had no idea how to respond without lying. I'll think about it, I said, sipping my water to hide the shake in my hand. That night, I lay in bed beside him, eyes open in the dark, wondering if he could sense the distance between us. The physical closeness was there, his body warm and still beside mine, but I felt like I was on the other side of a wall. One I had built, brick by brick, without meaning to. And now I didn't know how to take it down. The days that followed were routine again, but something had shifted. He began to take more notice of me. Brought home flowers one evening, just because. Asked if I wanted to go for a walk after dinner. He started texting me during the day, not just about groceries or errands, but little check-ins. How's your day going? Thinking of you. Sweet. Familiar. Late. I wanted to feel grateful. I wanted to feel moved. But instead, I felt a strange mix of resentment and regret. Why now? Why after all this time? At work, things quieted down. The pressure of the project lifted, and with it, the regular interactions between him and me faded. We were still cordial, still professional, but the urgency was gone. And so was the excuse to be near each other. I thought that distance would help. That maybe with space, whatever was pulling me toward him would dissolve. But it didn't. It just grew quieter. More patient. One afternoon, I found myself scrolling through old messages on my phone. Nothing incriminating. Nothing overt. Just fragments of conversation, tiny breadcrumbs of a story I wasn't ready to finish. At home, I became more withdrawn. Not intentionally. It wasn't rebellion. It was fatigue. The energy it took to act like everything was normal wore me down. I found myself going to bed early, reading longer, avoiding eye contact during meals. My husband noticed. I could tell by the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. He asked me one night, his voice gentle, "Is everything okay?" I hesitated. Then nodded. Just tired. It's been a lot. He didn't push. He rarely did. That weekend, he brought up the idea of the trip again. A cabin in the mountains. Just us, he said. No phones. No work. I agreed. Not because I wanted to go. But because I didn't have the strength to refuse. The night before we were supposed to leave, I stayed up late under the pretense of packing. He had gone to bed early. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, suitcase open but empty, and stared at my hands. I picked up my phone. Opened a new message. Typed a single word, tomorrow. Then I deleted it before I could hit send. Instead, I turned off the light and crawled into bed. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening to the sound of my husband breathing beside me. And I wondered what it said about me, that I had everything I was supposed to want, and yet a part of me still felt like it was missing. Like something essential had gone silent, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever hear it again. The morning was still when we left for the mountains. My husband packed the car with practiced ease of cooler, duffel bags, hiking shoes, the usual list of items he always prepared with meticulous care. I moved slowly, deliberately, placing things in my bag that I didn't need, as though the weight of unnecessary items might help me feel more grounded. The drive was quiet. Trees blurred past the windows, their late autumn leaves thinning into bare branches. He made occasional remarks about the road, the weather, a podcast he'd downloaded for the trip. I nodded, responded when I had to, but mostly stared out the window. I watched the landscape change. Towns growing sparser, signs less frequent, cell service slowly dissolving into nothing. It felt like driving into a pause. The cabin was nestled at the end of a narrow, unpaved road, surrounded by tall pine trees and silence. It had a wraparound porch, a fireplace, no television, no signal. I knew he meant well, an escape, a reset. He believed, maybe, that space and quiet could fix what had gone quiet between us. I wanted to believe that too. But wanting and feeling are rarely the same thing. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar. We unpacked side by side, moving around each other like we always had, familiar, efficient, wordless. He lit the fire while I set up the kitchen. After dinner, we sat in the living room, watching the flames flicker. He poured wine. I held the glass, sipped once, then set it down. He asked if I remembered the last time we'd taken a trip alone. I said yes, even though I didn't. He reminded me, it had been 5 years ago. Coastal, warmer, before our son left for school. Before the silence between us had become so heavy. I smiled faintly, the memory slipping through my mind like a photograph I couldn't fully recall. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed creaked each time I shifted. The air felt too still. I slipped out from under the covers and moved to the living room, wrapping myself in a blanket. The fire had gone out. I sat in the dim, fireless room, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, branches swaying, a distant owl, the wind pushing against the cabin's frame. I thought about everything. The past few months. The shifting weight of my choices. The moments I had buried beneath reason. I thought about his face, not my husband's, but his. My colleague. The one who had looked at me like I was more than someone's wife, more than someone's mother, more than someone reliable. I hadn't seen that look in a very long time. And it had awakened something in me I couldn't put away. The next day, we went for a walk through a wooded trail behind the cabin. The trees were tall and quiet, the ground soft beneath our feet. We didn't speak much. At one point, he reached for my hand, and I let him hold it. It felt kind, expected, distant. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. Back at the cabin, he made lunch while I sat on the porch, watching the sky darken as clouds gathered. A storm was coming. I welcomed it. I wanted the distraction. Later that afternoon, we played cards by the fire. We laughed once, something about how he miscounted his points. It was a small laugh, brief and fading. But for a moment, we felt like who we used to be. He asked, cautiously, "Do you feel like this is helping?" I didn't know what to say. So I said, "I think it's a start." It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either. That evening, as the storm began to roll in, the power flickered once, then held. Rain tapped steadily on the roof, and the wind moaned through the trees. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, blankets draped over our legs, a book open in his hands. I wasn't reading. I was thinking. I was remembering. I was reliving that moment in the co-working space. The quiet click of his laptop, the way his eyes searched mine for answers I couldn't give. The way I had wanted to reach across that table and say something real, but didn't. I was remembering the weight of restraint, how it felt like a pressure in my chest that never fully left. And then I was remembering the kiss. We spent the night together. That's how it would be described if anyone ever asked. But no one would ask. And no one would know. Because I had buried it deep, packed it away in a place even I was afraid to revisit. It hadn't been planned. It hadn't even been spoken about. But it had happened. On a night that felt like any other, in a room that looked like all the others we'd worked in. And when I think back to it, I don't remember what I was wearing. I don't remember what time it was. I remember only the way he looked at me like I mattered. That night at the cabin, I couldn't stay on the couch. I went outside, wrapped in my coat, and stood beneath the covered porch, watching the storm. The trees swayed, rain slanted sideways, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine. I closed my eyes and let the cold air sting my face. Behind me, I heard the door creak open. "You okay?" my husband asked from the threshold. "I just needed air," I said. He stood beside me in silence. We listened to the storm together. "I want us to be better," he said eventually. "Whatever it takes." I turned to him. His face was open. Earnest. Tired. I nodded. Not because I knew how. But because I didn't want to lie again. Later, in bed, I lay awake long after he fell asleep. His breathing steady, the storm now softened to a whisper. And I thought, sometimes, the hardest part of coming back isn't the distance. It's who you became when you were gone. We returned from the mountains on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The roads were clear, the traffic light, but the atmosphere in the car was denser than when we'd left. My husband talked occasionally, about the birds we'd seen near the cabin, about a neighbor who'd texted him to say a branch had fallen in our yard during the storm. I nodded, responded where I should, but my mind was elsewhere. Not on the trees, not on the branch, not even on the mountains. I was thinking about what came next. Coming home didn't feel like returning. It felt like entering a place I no longer knew how to live in. Everything was familiar, our house, our kitchen, the framed pictures in the hallway, but I felt like a visitor walking through a version of my life I had once occupied without question. The dining room chairs still creaked the same way, the hallway still echoed footsteps, the bedroom light still flickered when you turned it on too fast. And yet, something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't reverse. That evening, I unpacked in silence. Folded sweaters, socks, underthings. I noticed I had overpacked, as usual. There were outfits I hadn't worn, items I never needed. It struck me how often I prepared for things that never happened. At dinner, we said little. The clink of cutlery filled the space. He looked at me once, his gaze longer than usual, but he said nothing. I sensed he wanted to ask something but lacked the courage or clarity. Or maybe he knew the answer already and didn't want it spoken aloud. After he went to bed, I stayed in the kitchen. The dishwasher hummed. I sat at the table with a cup of tea I hadn't touched. My phone was face down. I hadn't looked at it in hours. I hadn't heard from him. I hadn't expected to. But I kept glancing at the black screen, waiting for it to light up. The next morning, work resumed like nothing had changed. But I had changed. I moved through tasks automatically, answered emails without thinking. People said hello, commented on the success of the project, asked how my weekend had gone. I gave answers that sounded real enough to pass. Around noon, I saw him. He walked past my desk on his way to the meeting room. Our eyes met briefly. No words. Just that glance. It lasted less than a second. But it held everything. The weight of what had happened, the silence that followed, the things we could not say. Later that day, I found a note slipped under my keyboard. Folded carefully. No name. I hope you're okay. I've missed talking to you. I stared at it for a long time. Then slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk and closed it. The days stretched. My husband grew quieter. At home, he watched me more than he spoke. I could feel it. The tension building in small, almost imperceptible increments. The way he lingered in doorways, the way he waited an extra beat before asking a question. He had begun to suspect. Or he already knew. Maybe he didn't need proof. Maybe absence was evidence enough. One night, as I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water, I found him standing at the counter, holding my phone. He looked up when he saw me. "You left this unlocked," he said, not accusing, not angry. Just stating. My heart stuttered, but I didn't react outwardly. "Okay," I said quietly. He set the phone down, face up, and stepped back. "I wasn't looking for anything," he added. I nodded. Neither of us moved. "After a moment," he said, "but I think I saw enough." I could have asked what he meant. But I didn't need to. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry." He nodded, slowly. "I know." We didn't argue. We didn't raise voices. We just stood there, two people in a dim kitchen with too many years between them and too few words left to use. That night, I slept in the guest room. He didn't object. He didn't come looking for me. The silence was no longer subtle. It was loud now. Pressing. The next day, I went to work earlier than usual. I sat in the parking lot for a while, staring at the building. Wondering how many moments had led to this. How many tiny decisions, glances, words left unsaid. When I entered the office, I took the long route to my desk. I avoided the hallway where I might see him. I didn't want to risk another glance, another note, another moment I wasn't ready for. But mid-morning, he appeared at my side during a team break. "I didn't mean to make things harder," he said. I shook my head. "You didn't." "I did." He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. We stood in silence for a few seconds. Long enough to acknowledge that we both knew it was over. That it had never truly begun. That it had mattered. That it still did. After he walked away, I sat at my desk and opened my inbox. I stared at the list of unread emails. None of them from him. I opened the drawer and pulled out the folded note. I read it again. This time, I didn't put it back. I tore it in half. Then again. Then again. At home that night, my husband was already in the living room, watching a documentary with the sound low. I sat beside him. Close, but not touching. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Eventually, he muted the TV and turned toward me. "Do you want to fix this?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "I don't know." He nodded once. Not in anger. In quiet understanding. "I think I do," he said. That surprised me. I looked at him. Really looked. At the lines around his eyes. At the tired kindness still buried in his face. At the man I had built a life with. And the man who had, somewhere along the way, become a stranger. "I'm not the same person," I said finally. "I know," he replied. "Neither am I. We didn't make promises. We didn't make decisions. We just sat there. In the silence. The air between us no longer empty, but waiting. The days that followed blurred together. Not because they were the same, but because they required so much of me to stay composed that I stopped remembering them individually. I went to work. I answered emails. I responded when spoken to. I sat through meetings and updated reports and listened as if I were fully present. But underneath the polished exterior, my thoughts moved differently now, slower, heavier, more aware of how much space I took up and how easily that space could collapse. At home, the tension was no longer quiet. It had shape now, pauses in conversation, doors closing a little too gently, the absence of touch, the avoidance of eye contact. My husband moved through the house with the kind of restraint that told me he was choosing silence not because he didn't want to speak, but because he was afraid of what he might say. There were moments I thought of breaking it, asking him to talk, telling him everything, from the beginning, without filter. But I never did. Not because I didn't want to be honest. But because I wasn't sure I could survive hearing the truth reflected back at me. One evening, I found him in the garage, sitting on the old bench we kept near the tool rack. He had the look of someone who wasn't doing anything in particular, just sitting because it was easier than sitting inside. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He didn't notice me at first. And then he did. He didn't speak. And neither did I. I turned away before the weight of the moment could become something irreversible. At work, things settled into a strained kind of normal. He and I didn't speak. Not in private. Not about anything beyond logistics. The new project required less collaboration between us, and I took that as a quiet mercy. We exchanged polite greetings in hallways, passed papers across tables, made eye contact only when necessary. There was no drama. No fallout. Just absence. And maybe that was harder. One afternoon, I found a note tucked beneath my keyboard again. This one wasn't folded. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even personal. It was a printout from a performance review, a note attached in his handwriting that said only, "Let me know if anything needs clarification." I read it 3 times, not for meaning, but because I wanted to see his handwriting again. Then I filed it where it belonged, and forced myself not to look back. At home that night, my husband made dinner. He cooked quietly, with an odd gentleness. I offered to help, and he said, "I've got it." We ate in near silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence we'd been swimming in for weeks. It was deeper. More like the space between 2 people who had already said everything worth saying. After the dishes were done, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table. I was still holding my glass of water, hands wrapped around it like it might keep me anchored. He looked tired. Not just from the day, but from everything. "I need to ask you something," he said. I nodded. "Did you fall in love with him?" I didn't expect the question. It was so precise. So unafraid. I looked down at my glass. The condensation had pooled in a perfect circle beneath it. "I don't know," I said quietly. He didn't react. He just sat there, absorbing the words, as if he'd already considered the possibility. Maybe he had. Maybe he had lived with it longer than I realized. "I want to believe we can get through this," he said after a long pause. "I do too," I replied, not because I was certain, but because I knew I had to say it out loud to see if it still held truth. He nodded. We sat there a few minutes longer. Then he stood and walked out of the room. I stayed at the table. The next morning, I got up before him. The house was still dark. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky brighten slowly over the neighborhood roofs. I thought about everything I'd done to end up at that moment, every choice, every silence, every part of myself I had silenced over the years. And then I thought about what came next. Later that day, I called my supervisor and requested 2 weeks off. Personal leave. No explanation. It was approved within minutes. That evening, I told my husband. He didn't ask where I was going. He only asked, "Do you want me to come with you?" I shook my head. "I think I need to go alone." He didn't argue. I booked a small cottage a few hours away, near the water. Not a tourist town. Just quiet. Solitary. I left 2 days later. The drive there was strange. I didn't play music. I didn't make phone calls. I let the road stretch ahead of me in silence, and with every mile, I felt some version of myself fall further behind. The cottage was simple. 1 room, 1 chair by the window, 1 bed. No television. No clock. No Wi-Fi. I spent the first evening sitting by the window, staring at the still water in the distance, trying to remember the last time I had been alone, not just physically, but truly alone with myself. I made tea. I wrote in a notebook I had packed but hadn't planned to use. I wrote the words I hadn't said. I wrote the questions I still didn't have answers to. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, listening to the wind outside, to the small creaks of the wooden walls, to the silence inside my chest that was slowly becoming bearable. The next day, I walked along the shoreline. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't check the time. I just walked. I thought about my marriage. About who we had been. About who I had become. About the man who had seen me in a way I hadn't been seen in years, and how dangerous that had been. I cried once. Briefly. Not from regret. But from exhaustion. And then I kept walking. By the end of the day, I knew something I hadn't known before. I wasn't running away. I was returning. Not to a person. Not to a place. To myself. I stayed at the cottage for 5 days. Not 2 weeks as I'd originally planned. I woke up on the 6th morning and knew it was time to go. Not because anything had happened, but because nothing had. And somehow, in that nothing, I had found what I came for. There were no grand revelations. No dramatic changes. Just stillness. The kind that feels uncomfortable at first, like walking into a room with no furniture. But once I stopped trying to fill the silence, I heard things again, my breath, the creak of my bones when I stretched in the morning, the way my thoughts slowed once I stopped chasing them. I listened to my own voice, the one I had buried beneath obligation and routine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't flinch when it spoke. I left the key on the table and locked the door behind me. The drive home was quiet, but I wasn't restless this time. I didn't check my phone once. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I just drove. The road curved gently through small towns and empty fields, the kind of places that don't expect anything from you. I breathed easily. When I arrived, the house was clean. The porch light was on. My husband's car was in the driveway. I stood outside for a moment before going in. The key turned in the lock with the same soft click it always had, and I stepped into the familiar scent of our home, coffee, old wood, the faintest hint of laundry detergent. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, slicing apples. He looked up, startled, then set the knife down and wiped his hands on the towel. "You're home early." "I know," I said. He studied me, searching for something in my face. "Did you find what you needed?" I hesitated before answering. "I think I found space. And some quiet." He nodded. That was enough. We didn't talk much that evening. But it wasn't avoidance. It was something gentler. A recognition that we were both carrying fragile things, and rushing into words might break them before we were ready. We shared a meal. We watched a show without really watching. And later, when we went to bed, he didn't reach for me. But he didn't turn away either. The next morning, I returned to the office. Nothing had changed. But I had. And that was enough to make the walls feel different, the lighting less harsh. I passed by his office. The door was closed. I kept walking. He didn't reach out. And neither did I. Weeks passed. My marriage became a place we both tried to occupy more honestly. There were long talks, sometimes uncomfortable, often quiet. We learned how to speak without defensiveness. How to listen without rushing to fix. We weren't the people we had been when we married. But we were beginning to understand the people we had become. One evening, he asked me if I wanted to repaint the bedroom. I laughed at the randomness of it. Why? Feels like it could use a change, he said. I said yes. Not because I cared about the color. But because I understood what he meant. I began going on walks alone again. Not to escape, but to return to myself in little ways. I brought back books from the library. I played the piano on weekends. I bought a new set of paints, even though I hadn't touched a brush in years. One Sunday afternoon, I sat on the back porch with a canvas propped on my knees. The light was soft, the air warm. I didn't try to make anything perfect. I just let the brush move. It felt clumsy, raw. But it was mine. And then, sometime later, an email came. Short. Simple. I just wanted to say thank you. For being the kind of person who made me remember something about myself I'd forgotten. I hope you're okay. I read it once. Then again. Then deleted it. Not out of anger. Not out of guilt. But because I didn't need it anymore. He had seen me. And I had seen him. But that chapter was closed. Not erased. Not denied. Just done. We hadn't made promises. We hadn't crossed every line. But what happened had been enough to change something in me. Enough to shake me awake. Enough to remind me that I was still alive, still capable of feeling, still made of more than responsibility and endurance. And yet, it wasn't him I chose to return to. It was myself. And in doing that, I found my way back to my marriage, not as a restoration of what had been, but as a quiet, deliberate rebuilding of something new. Not perfect. Not easy. But real. The kind of real that doesn't need explanation. Only presence. Only truth. And a little bit of space to breathe.